Thank you all for being here, Saints. I've made a PowerPoint for you for this live stream because a picture says more than 1,000 words. And even though it's not scriptural, it is a statement that's a fact. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to highlight this PowerPoint. I'm going to make it full screen. So okay, let me know if you can see the PowerPoint in full screen because that's what we need. If you're able to see it, I can begin with today's class. Most people are already in, so I'm happy with that. I have the live chat on my mobile phone, so I can follow you. All right. Okay, so the topic of tonight, or to morning for you, or afternoon, wherever you are, the topic of tonight is feudalism. Feudalism is a topic that historians are debating about. Some are even arguing about it. Well, we're not going to argue about it now. I'm just going to teach you about it. What is feudalism? When you look at the left illustration on the screen, you can see a pyramid. And in the pyramid, there are 4 layers. The top layer has a crown in it, labeled king. The second layer from above has nobles. Then you have a layer called knights, and then you have a layer called peasants. Now, this here was just an ideal of how people wanted things to be. Now, an ideal is based on an idea, something you imagine. So, what you see here is a projection of how the public wanted things to be. It doesn't mean that that's the way how things really were. And that's a big difference when you do historical research also. Now, as an anthropologist, as well as sociologist, there are times I have to do historical research also. Even though I'm not a licensed, not I mean certified historian, you can also be an historian just doing historical research. Some people are historians because they got a bachelor's degree or master's degree in history, and others are historians because they just do historical research. You can be a historian in whether through academic recognition or just by specializing yourself in historical fields. Now, as an historian that's focused on colonial history, I need to inform you that when you do historical research, that's the one thing you need to consider how people wanted things to be and how things actually were. Consequently, today, people may have different ideals than in the past. Not completely different, but there may be deviations of how people want things today. So often people tend to project how they want things today onto the past. And then they may come to conclusions about the past that may not be accurate for how things really were. Now, the same is with feudalism. Most people today that have access to the internet or to social media, they have been indoctrinated with this idea of democracy, that the people decide through elected officials. So many people, when they use the present day indoctrination and they look onto the past, they're going to come to the conclusion that people in the past were oppressed and that the people of today are free. Well, that's not exactly the case. Most people today didn't grow up in a country that was led by a king. Most people grew up in a country led by a cult led by a president. A president simply means someone that presides over a meeting. That's a president. A president presides over a meeting. So many countries today have established meetings that manage the country. They don't have an actual male leader with a male with his family that manages it, like in a kingdom. So, for many people today, the idea of a king or an emperor is something archaic or something of Disney. Even though, for the most part of human history, kings and emperors were the norm, and royal houses or imperial houses were the way things were done. And we today have been taught that democracy, so elected officials, is the best way. So we often firmly believe in this. And that's why we often conclude, oh, if there are elected officials in a country, then things must be well. If people can control everything, then that must be well. Well, that is an assumption that we were raised with. It's not how things actually are. Contrary, countries led by monarchs are often psychologically more stable than republics. So that's it's been repeated throughout history. So many people that think today that that the presidential system is more better than a monarchy, it's based on the validation of wanting to be in control, thinking if we can decide the head of state, we are in control. So people want to feel gratified if they are in control. That's why the world leaders gave them republics, so they think they are in control while they're not. Okay, so in the past, often people had a more realistic view of what worked than people of today. Because a lot of people of today don't even want to do research. They just have ideas or opinions that they were raised with and they want to be left alone. They don't want to be challenged. Now, throughout history, this reluctance to be challenged was there. But at least in the past, you had no choice but to be challenged. I mean, today, if you want to get away from reality for a moment, you can just pick up your mobile phone and listen to a lot of songs on Spotify. 200 years ago, this option did not exist. You couldn't even listen to music unless music was played. You couldn't record songs or record or just talk to someone to across the country instantly. So communication was slower, and there were no such thing as refrigerators nor microwaves. So even things like cooking or washing clothes had required more labor from the public. So previous generations ago, people had to be more realistic about what worked and what didn't. So when you do historical research, realize that your ideals of how you want things to be today is not necessarily how people thought back then. So things that we may not tolerate today, people in the past may tolerate. On the other hand, things that we are tolerating today in the past would have been an abomination. So that's what I wanted to say first. When it comes to feudalism, the key element of feudalism is avoidance. Repeat it after me in the live chat. The key element of feudalism is avoidance. Fallen mankind does not want to deal with risks. Fallen mankind just wants ease, relief continuously. All right, that is fallen mankind, where I discussed that in other live streams on the channel. So, fallen mankind does not want to be free. Fallen mankind doesn't want others to be free either. Fallen mankind was an external structure that arranges everything for them. That is what fallen mankind wants. Let me repeat it. Fallen mankind just wants external structures that does everything for them so that they don't have to be held accountable. So society is that external structure that worldlings crave onto. So since antiquity, the ancient leaders knew that the masses just want an external structure uh, to to govern them. They don't want to actually be involved in life itself. So that is why the ancient Greeks established local councils where people were elected. That's where democracy comes from, and they had a firm military structure of how leadership worked. That's what the ancient Greeks did. And through Hellenization by the Greek Empire, they were spread all over the world. Hellenization turned into Romanization when the Roman Empire took over the Greek world. And from the Roman Empire, you came the Roman Catholic Church, which was designed to counter the influence of Christianity. A lot of people think that Roman Catholicism is the origin of Christianity. It's not true. Christianity was long before Roman Catholicism came up. Roman Catholicism was designed to counter the growing financial impact of Christianity. So Emperor Constantine claimed to be a believer too, and he established the Catholic system. And the Catholic system continued Romanization, but he called it Christianization then, because he had this false version of Christianity that was promoted just to keep the world under Satan's grip. All right? So it was Hellenization, that became Romanization, from Romanization went to Christianization, And later in human history, you also had Islamization, that there was another version from the Islamic Empire. And from there, from Christianization, it was secularized to globalization. Okay? So do you get now where globalization originates from? Let me know in the live chat. So, globalization is a continuation of Hellenization to make the world subjected to Greek gods. That's all it is. And throughout history, they adapted to the circumstance because believers often rocked the boat and believers often hindered the plots of the wicked. So the wicked had to adapt. So that shows you that believers are the ones in charge, not the wicked. So Satan is only in charge of the paranormal and those in darkness. But on the earth, it's believers that are in charge. The world can only go so far as believers allow it to go. So the ancient Greeks, and you could say the ancient Romans, who came from the same population, were like this. The ancient Greeks were quite direct in what they were doing, while the Romans were more soft, had a more soft attitude. Because the Romans realized, if we do everything the Greek way, people may take offense. The Greeks are very open with their hatred of women and with their man boy love relationships, pedophilia, and all of that. So and the sacrifice of the Greek gods. So you know what, we do exactly the same thing because we're an extension of the Greek civilization, but we have to do it in a more soft way. We do it in a Roman way. So Roman culture was actually a renovation of the Greek culture to make it more softer, so to make it more appealing to the rest of the world. For example, the ancient Celts or ancient French people were quite opposed to Greek culture. So the Romans developed a kind of a culture that was between the Celts and the Greeks in the East, just to appease them. So the Romans were a more soft version of the Greek of dominance. So the Romans decided, you know what? This firm military grip that we have to soften it a little bit and let some of the public benefit from it. Because if the public does not benefit, it's more likely for them to revolt. So when Western Rome shut down in 410, a slow process began that took around 7 decades. A slow process began where the Western Roman provinces were turned into Roman Catholic kingdoms. And in those Roman Catholic kingdoms, yet the ideal was yet a king at the top, was from a blue blood household. Then you had the noble families. Those were the families of the Germanic warlords who married into Roman or Greek nobility. They owned much. Now they actually possessed much of the land and the ships, so they actually had the economic relevancy. Then you had the knights. Those were common men who helped out the nobles, and because of that, they got good salaries or they got small plots of land somewhere. So you had the knight class, and then you had just the common public, which were the peasants living on farms or small towns and villages. That was the ideal that the Romans developed when the Western Empire collapsed. Now, this ideal was also taken over in the East, but the East was still more rigid in it. So, feudalism is actually ancient Rome's vision of continuing their grip on the masses without having a state structure. And why is this appealing to the masses? Because things are arranged. The masses don't have to figure things out. If you're born in a village somewhere, then you're likely to stay a farmer for the rest of your life, or you may become a blacksmith or a musician, whatever. So you have options in life, but your options limited. If you're born in a knight in a household of knights, then you're likely to become a civil servant of the government or of the Roman Catholic Church. If you were born in a noble household, then it was destined for you to have government ambitions. And it was destined for you to just have economic ambitions because you belonged to the class of people with the economic power. And you were told that you have to take care of the masses who don't have economic power. So being born in a noble household brought pressure with you to look after the economic welfare of the whole community. And if you were from the royal household, you were kind of elevated above the nation, and you had to be separate from the people just to maintain leverage over them. So it was arranged how life was. And this is what common people want. Common people want to have external structures that arrange everything so they don't have to bear any of the responsibility nor accountability for what happens. They just want a machine to get along with. That's the mindset of worldlings. And the ancient Greeks, or we say also the ancient Romans, knew this, and the Catholic system extended this. So, feudalism, however, was not accepted by everyone. When you look at Asia, for example, because the leaders in Asia were Apollonians also worshipping Apollo, the leaders in Asia went with the Greek style, having a firm grip. Look at the Chinese Empire, look at the Korean kingdoms, look at the Empire of Japan, look at the kingdoms in Southeast Asia, or the kingdoms in South Asia, what they call India, Pakistan, and those areas. Those Asian leaders face a lot of opposition from the public because it's one thing to have an external structure that arranges everything, but it's another thing when that external structure completely shuts you down. So this is something that the Romans, from the midst of, or best that the ancient Italians understood, contrary to the Greeks in the east of the Mediterranean. If it's too obvious to the masses that they have no options, they will escalate, they will feel upset, and they will rage. But if you give them a symbolic type of freedom in the matter, they will get along with it. So, for example, if you enter a shop and you point a gun to someone's face and tells them, "Give me the money," then they know that they need to give you money or else. Then they will comply, but there will be resentment afterwards. But let's say you have people entering a shop, but they wear uniforms, and they ask the people, "Could you please send over the money to us, please?" While having their guns. If those people understand that saying no will cause trouble, they will likely still comply even when they don't want to, but they will be more at ease with it because they feel like they're in charge of it. So when you give people the psychological reward as if they are in charge, they are more likely to comply with their own oppression. That is the weird psychology of worldly people. Give them a symbolic grip on something, just symbolic, not an actual grip, and they will get along. Or you make sure that there are enough victims for them to victimize, then they won't bother with you either. But if it's too obvious that it's a rigid thing and they have no options, they go off at you. And the Chinese empire collapsed multiple times because of it. In the West, namely, let's say Europe, they did it in a better way. They conducted feudalism in a way that the locals still felt like they had options. And when it happened that a feudal contract went way too far, the people just revolted. And here's the thing: you also had commoners doing feudalism amongst each other. So both the you could say the elite practiced feudalism as well as the locals. So it wasn't as if the elite decided absolutely everything. Also, the locals had their own feudalism. For example, you had farmers in what we now call the Netherlands, who had their own small clubs that managed farmland, apart from the Catholic princes that managed the area. So the Catholic princes had their castles, or the castles, I mean, and around the castles they had um, some militia that protected them with their castle, but that's it. So you had castle lords in the Netherlands who were Catholic that got their funding from the Roman Catholic Church. So the castle lords were not powerful at all. They were just rent boys of the Catholic Church. They depended on the Vatican to send money to them on a regular basis. So you had the castle lords, for example, in the medieval area in the Netherlands, they had their castles. They were paid by the Roman Catholic Church, and in turn they paid militias to protect them. And then you had the common public out there, most of were peasants. Some lived in small villages. So what happened was that the Dutch farmers in the Netherlands, they arranged the economy by themselves, autonomously. So you had the castle lords, but the only thing they did was to force the public to pay some taxes. That's the only thing that happened. For the rest, the castle lords had nothing to say. So it was feudalism, but not in the sense that the castle lords actually were at the top. There were times the castle lords even starved and they needed to ask the public for assistance. Yes, it happened that those castle lords often had to ask the public, the peasants, for help because they were starving in their castles. And this was the case all over Europe. That's why on the right you see a map, and I'm going into the maps right now. So if you can bear with me. Now, this is a computer generated map to show the political situation around the year 1200. Okay? Now, what you see on this map is that you see the Byzantine Empire, which the Roman Empire. Well, the Roman Empire still existed back then, but was in a very small state in the what they call southeast of Europe and present-day Turkey. You still had the Roman Empire over there, but the Roman Empire was falling apart because you had the Islamic Empire that took over, that conquered most of the Eastern Roman Empire, which was called the Byzantine Empire. So you had the Muslim dynasties you see over here in northern Africa, also in what today called the Middle East. And you see also the south of what today called Spain or the Iberian Peninsula was also an Islamic caliphate run by black folks, but that's something they often won't tell you. And so then you also had the one, two, three, you had four Catholic kingdoms: Navarre, Aragon, Castile, and Leon. Leon had a province called Portugal. Portugal is separated as a separate kingdom called Portugal, which was officially called Lusitania. Then you had the Kingdom of France. You had the Kingdom of England, which was a unification of the Anglo-Saxon dynasties. Scotland was still divided. Ireland was divided in two because England possessed half of Ireland economically. Due to the economic relevancy of the English elite, they kind of extorted the Irish people. Then you had the Danish people that had a nation called Denmark, which was quite fractured also. You had Sweden. Hungary was a big nation also. You had the smaller dynasties in the east of Europe, which were not really that stable. And you had the Norwegians, and the Norwegians had their own country. Norway existed, but Norway was divided in tribes here and there, and all preferred their own local dialects above common Norwegian. So there was a whole nother issue over there. So in the center, you see the Holy Empire. Yes, the Catholics established an empire called the Holy Roman Empire. Yes, they did. And it comprised most of present-day Central Europe, the Netherlands, and the east of France, and the northern parts of Italy. Now, the Holy Roman Empire was meant to be a unified empire that should function as one country where everyone spoke German. That was the purpose of it. But in reality, you had Italians living in there that spoke Italian, and you had various Italian dialects also. You had the Swiss people that spoke a Swiss type of German. Even amongst the German peoples, you had various sorts of Germans that you had. So you had Bavarian German, you had Prussian German. So you had various German dialects also, which some of them were quite diverse. You also had Old Dutch, and it means classical Dutch, being spoken in what they call the Netherlands. And you also had people that just spoke French. So linguistically speaking, there was no common language for the Holy Roman Empire. And because of that, that massive country failed. The feudal dream of the elite failed in the Holy Roman Empire. Now, in the Kingdom of France, it kind of succeeded, but even there were areas where the King of France was just not welcome. There were areas, that means close to England, where the King of France was simply not welcome. So if the King of France would send a militia, the farmers would just fight the militia. So just because on the map France was one country doesn't mean that in reality it functioned as a country. And there was a point even in history that the France took over England, and the king of France, also the king of England, but that was also disputed. So there was a whole mess going on. So this just to show you that the feudal dream of the elite was just that. It was a dream. But the dream in reality had a lot of problems with it. For example, the Holy Roman Empire had over three or more than 300 tax divisions. Normally, a country has one tax division of one authority demanding taxes. The Holy Roman Empire had over 300. So you had 300 different types of taxes depending on where you were. So how do you regulate all those hundreds of tax regulations? It's not possible. So the Holy Roman Empire itself, it was a country on paper. People called it a country on paper, but in reality, it didn't function as a country at all. And you even had kingdoms within the Holy Roman Empire that were at war. So you have one country called the Holy Roman Empire, and you have various kingdoms fighting each other in military combat. You had civil wars here and there all over the place. So the Holy Roman Empire was actually a big failure, and it was a big embarrassment to the Catholic Church. But it still had this reputation of being this Catholic stronghold. That's why they kept it going. But the Netherlands, for example, the people that lived in the Netherlands wanted to get away from the Holy Roman Empire because they didn't want to be part of it. But they still were. But what did the Dutch people do to get away from the tyranny of the Holy Roman Emperor, as he was called? What the Dutch did was they developed trade agreements with cities in Scandinavia and the Baltic area. That was called the Hanse Alliance. And so the Hanse Alliance were alliances between Dutch cities and cities in Scandinavia and the Baltic area. Not Baltic, yes, the Baltic area. And they traded in grain, they traded in beer, in wine. So they managed to bypass the financial oppression of the Holy Roman Emperor. Okay? So eventually, when let me go further with this so that you can see. If you go from 1200 to how say 1400, you see already now how things shifted. Around 1400, again on paper, the Holy Roman Empire was considered a country, but by 1400, that was during the you had the plague that happened in Europe that killed over 70% of the population. So there was a lot of death and all of that. So after that, the people that survived the plague, they really wanted their own autonomy because they were thinking those holy Roman rulers are not holy at all. They mismanaged the economy, and because of them, there were many famines and a lot of diseases. So what happened was that the Holy Roman Empire remained a region on paper. It was not treated as a country anymore. For example, Bohemia, which today we call Czechia or the Czech Republic, by then it's called Bohemia. Bohemia was a client kingdom of the Roman Empire that later continued as a Catholic kingdom. Bohemia had its own economy, its own king, and they didn't listen to the Holy Roman Emperor at all. You example had the Venice. Venice became a republic and began to trade with the Islamic world. Even though it was officially part of the Holy Roman Empire, it was a republic. So the Holy Roman Emperor, that German guy, was symbolic, their leader, but in reality, he didn't lead anything. And the Frisians, that Dutch tribe, even begged the Catholic Church to let the Crown of Castile manage them instead of that guy that lived in Central Europe. That's how bad things were. So the Holy Roman Empire was actually the failure of feudalism openly. You couldn't imagine a bigger failure than that. On paper, they all stayed together, but the Holy Roman Emperor had no actual power at all. You had the Habsburg dynasty, which was a royal bloodline from Austria, which back then was called the Habsburg duchy. They became the wealthiest of all the noble houses in Europe. And they eventually perpetrated their economic relevancy to take over the Iberian Peninsula and also the Netherlands, which was the Netherlands had a lot of trade, especially in the south, which later became Belgium. So the Habsburg people really wanted to take it over. So let's continue further. Now, this map is about around 1500 after Columbus. Now, Spain here is painted as one country, but as you will see clear, Spain was actually as a collection of two unions, Castile and Leon and Aragon. Okay, they formed a union called Spain, but Spain was a union, was not one country. Spain itself consisted of several tiny countries. France was the only firm country in Europe back then. The only firm country in Europe back then was France. Okay, Spain was a union of tiny countries. Portugal was also a firm country, but it was quite a weak country. And England was becoming a firm country, but look at this. England lost much of its grip over Ireland due to revolts. Scotland was firm, not want to be part of England. You had the Kalmar Union in Scandinavia, where they all joined with one another. The Holy Roman Empire was still there, but they still were desperately trying to hold together, but people really didn't want to be part of it. Then you had Poland. Poland succeeded to leave the Holy Roman Empire altogether, and they, together with the Lithuanians, established their own supercountry called the Poland-Lithuania Commonwealth. So you had the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania that formed one supercountry, and they united much of Eastern Europe. So Poland, which was just a tiny, tiny fraction of the Holy Roman Empire, eventually became a superpower on land, while the Holy Roman Empire was just this sick, dying man that people didn't want to admit that it was. So what you see here is that most of Europe was just a mess. Spain, which also included the south of Italy and Sardinia and all of that, was quite powerful. All right? So I want to continue with the Spanish Union. This is a map that shows situation around the 1500s. As you see, you don't have one country called Hispania. It was various tiny kingdoms here and there. You had Galicia, you had Catalonia, you had Valencia, you had Sevilla, you had Cordoba, Malaga, Jaén was another kingdom. You had Nueva Castilla. So you had all those kingdoms with all their own flags, their own institutions, their own languages, form this union called Spain. All right. So and you had two unions. You had the Aragon Union, led by the Catalonians, and you had the Castile and Leon, led by, you could say, the Castilians. And together we call the Spanish people. And the Catalonians also managed most of Italy. All right, so that was the situation. You can see it here much better. Blue is the crown of Castile and Leon. Orange is the crown of Aragon or Catalonia. And the other parts were not part of Spain at all, but were part of the Austrian, of the Habsburg grip over Europe. And Castile and Leon and Aragon were led by the Habsburg dynasty from Austria back then. And one of the guys of the Habsburg dynasty who grew up in the Netherlands, a Dutch boy called Karel in Dutch, in German is Karl, and in Spanish Carlos. He became king. He unified everything as one union called Spain, and he managed both the Netherlands as well as the south of most of Italy and Spain, and all of the discovered of what they consider the New World, the Americas. Now, feudalism. Spain was not a country; it was a union. Actually, it was two unions working together. with the same head of state. What do you do with two continents across the ocean? Now, the Spanish Union was bankrupt, so it were Italians sponsored by the Catholic Church that financed it. Cristobal Colon, or how we call him Columbus, was an Italian to begin with. So what happened was that the Spanish had to extend the crown of Castile and Leon. So what they did was, when Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, he was ordered to establish an administration. Now Columbus, or Cristobal Colon as it was really called, committed genocide on the Taino Indians. Around 3 million died, and there were those that survived and fled to other places. But it was a big embarrassment, so Cristobal Colon had to be removed, and his son Diego Colon became the viceroy of this new kingdom called Santo Domingo. And Santo Domingo was later divided in Santo Domingo and Castilla del Oro. Castilla del Oro was what we today would call Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua, and parts of Honduras. That was called Castilla del Oro, and the rest of the Caribbean islands, all the Caribbean islands, so all of them, including Curacao, Aruba, Barbados, all of them were called Santo Domingo. So the Spanish established two countries, but those countries were way too big. So from 1500 all the way till 15 to the 1560s, 6 decades, they were actually negotiating how to which countries would work. Now in 1520, this gambler took over the Aztec Empire, and from there, Charles in Spain, or Carlos, was informed. And then, because they lacked manpower, because most of the people in Spain didn't want to cross the ocean, they picked up slaves from West Africa to conquer the rest of the territories for them. And those black slaves ended up having to building the roads, building the ships, some of the Spanish cities, all of that. So it was black slave labor that established the Spanish and Portuguese empires. But this is something that they likely won't tell you in history class. But in Latin America, they know this. Now, the Indians on the mainland, in the beginning, they got along with the Spanish because they thought, oh, it's something new, a new inclusion. But eventually, the Indians amongst each other revolted against, okay, we all get along with this new empire called Spain, but hey, now the Indians were fighting on who had who owned what in the new Spanish Empire. It led to riots, revolts. There were also diseases carried over, so a big portion of the population of North and South America decreased. So that's what happened. And from 1520 till 1580, the Spanish established kingdoms, they established countries in North and South America and in Asia, which they call the Philippines. So still, it was a union of two crowns. It was a union of two subunions, Castile and Leon and Aragon. And Castile and Leon and Aragon also had conflicts with one another, so that's why they decided to extend Castile. But with them extending Castile and not Aragon, the Catalonians became upset. So the Catalonians received Venezuela as an area where they were allowed to trade freely, but Venezuela was a mess back then, for real. So let's go to the next slide. To maintain this massive area, the Spanish had 4 or 5 layers of governing. And I'm going to explain them in the next slide. And here I have the names in Spanish as well as the English translation of it. And remember, it was black slave labor that made all of this possible. So eventually, some of the black folks that became free participated in managing all that area. For example, potatoes, which emerged from the Americas, became dominant in Europe due to black slave labor um, harvesting it and putting them on ships towards Europe. So every culture in Europe that uses fries today or potatoes in their dishes, they should give thanks also to uh, the to the ancestors of black folks today, of the black diaspora or African diaspora, because they're the ones that made it possible. Tomatoes came from South America, and I believe also in Central America there was, but anyway, mainly from South America. And in Italy, tomato sauce, you can't take it away now. It's part of Italian culture. How did it happen? Black slave labor in the Spanish and Portuguese territories. Corn from mainly North America, yellow corn, also black slave labor made the transportation much possible. I'm just pointing this out is that when they talk about history, they often omit the accomplishments and contributions of black folks. That's why I remember it now. The Spanish Empire, including the Portuguese Empire that kind of merged with it to some extent, were only possible to the black slave labor because the white Portuguese and white Spanish people were not willing to do all the work. They didn't even want to migrate to their own colonies. Now, Spain had no colonies because Spain was not a country, but you get what I'm saying here. Now, what you see here are the layers. I'm going through them one by one. Um, Let me start from below. That's much better. Corri- corregimiento. Corregimiento. A corregimiento, or called corregiment in English, is a least division of a government. So what the Spanish did was they would rent a part of the government to locals. And a royal officer from Spain would manage that rented part of the government. Weird, but they would rent a part of the government to some of the locals. And those locals were often um, the wealthy Amerindians or the wealthy blacks that were over there. Because you also had wealthy black folks who escaped slavery and persisted in their freedom. All right? So, yes, that's a corregimiento. Above the corregimiento, you had the alcaldía mayor or the provincia. Now, alcaldía mayor and provincia, they're in practice they were the same, but there's a difference. A provincia was actually a province, and it was treated as a province. But the issue was, it was not a province of Spain. It was just a Spanish province, but not a province of Spain, because Spain as a country did not exist. It was a Spanish province that belonged to another kingdom that Spain established in the Americas. There's a difference. All right? And Alcaldía Mayor was actually a province where the Catholic Church had most of the say. For example, San Salvador, which today we call El Salvador, that area was a province that where the Roman Catholic Church had most of the say. That's why it's called the Alcaldía Mayor. All right? Now, in the 18th century, the people got fed up with the Roman Catholic Church controlling almost everything. So the Spanish government also took some role in the affairs and they established the intendancy system. The intendancy system was a system that was used in France, which was relatively quite stable as a country. And the intendancy system works like this. The Spanish government appoints a military guy who puts much soldiers in the province, and the province becomes like a tiny country managing itself. And the people in that province have direct contact with the office of the king in Madrid. So the people were offered a way to communicate with the Spanish government directly through the intendancies. All right, so it was not a democratic system, but the people had representation. Now, above the provinces, or you had the kingdoms, really, that they were a part of. But a kingdom had to be managed by a king, but the king lived in Europe. And the royal family, most of the time, was in Europe. There were some of the royals that moved around, but the head of state itself was in Spain most of the time, or traveling throughout Europe. I don't know of any record of any of the kings crossing the Atlantic. Maybe it happened, but I'm not sure of it. So, because you have all those kingdoms, but the king can only be in one place at a time, you have to have a representative. Now, in the beginning, it were actually Catholic priests that managed stuff. But over time, the Spanish government insists that it should be the navy that does it. So the use of captaincy generals came in, or in Spanish called Capitania General. A captain general is really a sailor who reached a high rank of, or you could almost say an admiral, and he was appointed by the king directly, personally, to manage a kingdom in the Americas. Now, there were also European kingdoms managed by captain generals, but in general, it was something in the Americas. So the captain general was the one managing a country on behalf of the king with the navy. So the role of the Catholic Church decreased and the role of the Spanish Navy increased. And throughout the Spanish Empire, you had those courthouses that managed all the conflicts and all the kingdoms. And each of such courthouses was called a Real Audiencia y Cancilleria. A Cancilleria is a chancellery. So it was a royal court and a chancellery. Okay? And you have several of them. Now, in the case of Guatemala, you had one Real Audiencia y Cancilleria, and that was also the place where the captain general was and governed the whole place. In some places, there was no audiencia, and the captain general just had to have his own office. All right? So that's how they divided the area. Now, here you can see an overview all the way from Alaska to the tip of South America, including the Philippines and many Asia Pacific islands. To have all those sub-countries of your union, you need to have an overview on how to manage them. So Spain had two regional governments. A regional government was a virreinato. A virreinato or virreinato, depending on the pronunciation, which dialect of Spanish you use. The virreinato, or in English, viceroyalty, was the regional government that had direct contact with the King of Madrid. Now, in North America, it was the viceroyalty of New Spain, or Virreinato de Nueva España. In South America, it was the viceroyalty of Peru, or the Virreinato de Peru. All right? Now, in practice, the viceroyalties were just regional supervisors, all they were. Over time, two more viceroyalties were made because Peru was way too big. Peru was not a country; it was a viceroyalty. Okay, and this viceroyalty managed all of South America, including Panama, from Lima. But this was way too much. So eventually, the viceroyalty of New Granada, or Virreinato del Reino de Nueva Granada, was established, and also the viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, Virreinato de Rio de la Plata, also the viceroyalty of Buenos Aires, was established also to manage stuff. Portugal became part of the Spanish Union for a moment, but later they separated again. But Portugal remained financially, economically dependent on the Spanish success in general. Just don't tell that to Portuguese people, please. But okay, that's the case. But even though you had all these viceroyalties, there were three kingdoms that remained practically independent. The Kingdom of Chile. Chile was a kingdom that was independent from the start. The viceroy in Peru only had a symbolic authority over there. The Kingdom of Venezuela, which was created in 1777, was as good as independent with only direct contact with Spain. And the Kingdom of Guatemala, what today is most of Central America, was also as good as independent. The Kingdom of Guatemala actually had more freedom than all the other Spanish territories altogether. And that led to some envy amongst the Spanish people back then. The south of Italy later became separate just to take the load off of the Catalonians a little bit. And the Catalonians were able to expand themselves in Venezuela because Venezuela kind of became the informal overseas kingdom of the Catalonians. That's why in Venezuela you also had a city called Barcelona. All right? Now, you would say, what about the Dutch territories? Now, the Dutch occupied a portion of South America, but the Dutch were never recognized officially, ever. It's after the Napoleonic era that the Dutch grip in South America was solidified as Suriname. Before that, the Dutch were only tolerated by the Spanish and the French, who also had a portion called French Guiana. All right? So, okay, let's continue. Now, about feudalism. We're going to talk about the Kingdom of Guatemala now. Tell me an error. Tell me what's wrong with this country just looking at this. What is wrong with this country, how this country is set up? Just look at it for 2 minutes and then tell me what's wrong with this country. I'm going to give an explanation. So the star is the royal is the audiencia. That's where the government was. That's where also the captain general lived and governed the kingdom. And the red dots are actually government houses from which actually the provincial capitals of the provinces. Okay, and the black dots were just urban centers, cities here and there. Now look at this map. Think about the bigger picture for 2 minutes and then tell me what is wrong with this country. I'll be back in 2 minutes. All right, I am back. So let me look at the answers you've given. Okay, Marky Mark said too many cities in a close area. It seems there's too much water around it. Um, that's just the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean, but okay. Maria said they're smack in the middle of water. Well, most of the trade back then went overseas, so there shouldn't be a problem. Justin said looks underdeveloped. But okay, just think about feudalism for a moment. Just look at this. Let me just explain this to you. Central America was called Guatemala, name meaning the Great Forest, because it was a big mass of mass of land filled with rainforest, and you had Indians living in that rainforest, and the Mayans occupied most of the rainforest. You had minor tribes in the south of Central America occupying other parts. Okay, the Mayans built small towns. They also had a few cities. So the Mayans had their civilization over there, and other Indians like the Nicaraguan Indians and the Comayaco Indians, they had their thing going on also. What was for the biggest part rainforest? When the Spanish came, they realized, there's a very thick rainforest. So the Spanish built two capitals, but both of them were destroyed by the natives because it was on sacred land, or the natives revolted against it. So eventually, in agreement with the natives, an Italian Spanish architect designed Santiago de Caballeros de Guatemala, the, gen, the gentleman of Santiago of Guatemala, or the gentleman of St. James of Guatemala. They established his capital between the mountains, and that capital exists still this day, but it's a national monument of the Republic of Guatemala today. It's a big tourist attraction. I've been there. I've even walked in the palace where the Captain General used to live. So Santiago de Guatemala became the capital of Central America, and many Spanish people from Europe moved over there. And you also had the wealthy Amerindians moving there also, and yet wealthy blacks living there also. And you also had Asians because you also had Asian slaves that were deported. They also had Asians who were involved in the Spanish trade. So people from Korea, Japan, the Chinese Empire, from uh, Vietnam, Cambodia, all of that. So you had also some of the Malay people from the Philippines. You also had a lot of Asians that moved to Central America that also moved to that city. So Santiago de Guatemala became this multicultural, multi-ethnic city in Central America that managed all of Central America. It had around 40,000 inhabitants at the time. All right, so you had diplomats over there, you had military personnel. Yes, you had diplomats from all over the world being there also. But the thing is, the Europeans, and to some extent the Asians, they were used to have big cities. And the natives over there, the Amerindians, were not used to very big cities. So the Amerindians remained in their local towns or villages. But the Europeans and Asians, they um, they began to construct big cities. And most of the big cities were built close to Santiago de Guatemala. So most of the big cities centered around that portion of landmass near the Pacific coast. So much of the lands near the Caribbean shores were not occupied. And as a result, there were Indians or Amerindians in those areas that could openly revolt against Spanish rule, and they actually opposed much of the Spanish influence. So what happened was that there was an urban region that developed where most of the people lived, and a lot of the natives also eventually moved to bigger cities. So you had this urban area that developed in the north, and you had a more rural area in the south. So there was a big division. And many of those cities were not built at rivers. Normally, you build a city at a river for trade. But here's the thing: the only trade possible from those cities was trade with Asia. But trade with Asia was took quite long because you had the Pacific Ocean to cross. So the economy of this country depended on the export happened through the province of Honduras. And the province of Honduras had a lot of black folks living there, roaming there freely. Some of those black folks mixed with the Amerindians, and it became the Garifuna blacks that exist till this day. So the kingdom of Guatemala kind of became isolated from the world's economy, in the beginning. In the beginning, Guatemala as a kingdom was kind of a periphery, kind of a ghetto because of this. And that's another um, side effect of feudalism. They all wanted to be close to the capital, and they didn't realize if you're all close to the capital, then who is managing the rest of the area? So the kingdom of Guatemala was the target of pirates and sea robbers all the time. And when I was doing research after this historical country, there was one thing I was shocked by. In the beginning, so from 1542 till around 1650, for example, that is about 120 years, the first 120 years of this kingdom. First of all, the kingdom was only finished in 1580. 1542, the kingdom was established, but it was in 1580 that most of the roads and the capitals were finished. So they started a kingdom without actually being a country setting over there. I don't think that's quite wise to do, but they did it. Okay? So, but at least for the first 120 years, or you can say the first 70 years, if you consider 1580 to be the actual beginning of the country, but most people take 1542. The first 80 till 120 years, there was almost no mail delivery from that area to the rest of the world. Twice a year, there was a there was a fleet of ships departing from the province of Honduras towards Spain. Now, if you had a letter or you want to write something to a relative in Spain or in somewhere else in Europe, that was your chance twice a year. It was also twice a year that you could put your production on ships to trade. Twice a year. But there were ships on a regular basis, almost daily, arriving in the Spanish settlements in South America, as well as in Mexico and on Cuba and all of that. So the kingdom of Guatemala was kind of the forgotten child of the Spanish Empire for a long time. Now this changed around 1650 when more investment was needed. They built more postal services, they built more ports, they built more shipyards and all of that. So eventually it improved, but in the beginning it was like a ghetto. All right? So let's continue. So this is a place where feudalism in the beginning was a big failure, but eventually it kind of succeeded. Now another area where it completely failed all the time was the area we today call Panama. Panama is a tiny landmass. Well, it's not really tiny for human beings because it's quite big, but when you look at the bigger picture, North and South America is just a tiny landmass that connects North and South America. But this tiny landmass, let's say like this, it proved difficult to manage. There were 3 royal audiencias established throughout history, and all of them failed to manage it. And Panama was actually the center of piracy, human trafficking, smuggling, and prostitution of native children, all of that. Yes, it was a criminal brothel already since then. So the kingdom of Guatemala eventually said, we don't want Panama because we don't want to deal with that stuff. So the kingdom of New Granada had to take it. So they divided into the province of Veraguas in the west and the province of Panama in the east. They wanted to build a Panama Canal to make it easier for ships to pass through, but they never succeeded in building the canal because it was a place haunted by criminal activity and human trafficking. The only stable side of slavery was you knew where you would end up. With human trafficking, you had no idea who would kidnap you and outlaw you would end up in a brothel or Organ harvesting did happen back then, not to put organs into other people, but for sacrifices and medicinal purposes. All right, so the feudal project here was a complete failure. Until this day, even almost 200 years after the end of Spanish rule, the consequences of this failure are still visible in the Republic of Panama. Now, so when we continue, well, let me, well, yes, the mouse here. As you understand the feudal aspect in the Spanish Empire, it was successful in key areas. For example, they had the Kingdom of Yucatan, the Kingdom of Guatemala, Kingdom of Mexico, Kingdom of New Galicia. Yet all those countries that they established sometimes remain provinces. But there's one big issue with feudalism that many don't realize. By the way, this is just a drawing that shows how the economy worked, the world's economy back then, which went through the Spanish Empire. There's one big issue with feudalism, and that is that once it's successful, you have urbanization, bigger cities, and people want autonomy. And once people want autonomy, there's no way of reversing this. Now, so the Spanish Empire, you can divide it in two eras. You had the Habsburg era, which was when the German household from Austria uh, managed it. And you had the Bourbon era, that was when you had the Bourbon kings from France managing it. Okay, so you have the German era and you have the French era. Okay, now the German era, you had civil provinces which were quite weak. You had a small military, and by the way, the Spanish Navy around 1500 only had 24 ships. 24 ships only for such a massive area. That's way too little, but that's what they had. So they had a pathetic military presence. The church handled most of the economy. So it was more the Catholic Church that was involved than the Spanish government. That's why the Spanish Empire was also called the Catholic monarchy, because it was the Catholic Church that actually did most of the stuff. And the Catholic Church had most of the economic relevancy over there. So the Catholic Church had more to say than the Spanish government. And the Catholic Church owned most of the money and most of the financial resources. Then the only communication between those countries and Spain was through the royal audiencias, or to the audiencias. That's the only interaction there was. And in the case of Guatemala, there was almost no communication whatsoever. You had poor postal services, so there were many peripheries, so ghettos had formed. And the land that was owned, besides Catholic Church, were by noble European families. Most of them settled in what today call Buenos Aires and Costa Rica. So Costa Rica, the area of Buenos Aires, as well as the area around Mexico City, those were the areas where most of the white folks from Europe settled. The rest was just Amerindians and blacks. Blacks became the majority in most of those places in the Spanish Empire. The good thing was that everyone was a Spanish citizen if you were not a slave, but the thing is, being a citizen is not very relevant if the country or empire you're a citizen of is quite weak. Okay, so over time, the Bourbon kings from France realized that the feudal empire they had did not work properly, and it was about to collapse if nothing was done. So what they did was, slowly but slowly, they reformed everything. So all the Spanish provinces of those kingdoms were militarized. So they increased the military presence. They allowed free trade with foreigners. So before, if you lived on the Spanish rule, you were not allowed to trade with the Dutch, with the British, nor with the Danish, nor with the Swedish, nor with people from Africa, nor with the Asians freely. Everything had to go through the audiencias. But suddenly, as a local man, you were allowed to start your own business, or if you had a farm, you're allowed to export your own stuff and earn money. A lot of people were happy with this. Uh, with the new intendancy system, there was direct communication between the provinces and Spain directly, and locals could also file petitions to the king. So there was more interaction between the people within the empire itself. There were better postal services, so communication was quicker. Instead of having to wait uh, f- um, 5 months to get an answer from Spain. Now you get an answer just within 2 months because the ships, you had bigger ships now. You had, and also on the rivers, there were steamships being used, but that was quite rare. So, and you had more horses being bred, so to order transport messages on the roads. So that increased also. And urbanization took place, so many people moved to the big cities. And you had trade cartels that formed. That included native people, those Amerindians, Negroes, or black folks, as well as migrants. So you had multi-ethnic trade cartels that formed, that operate together. Like you could say, they developed colonial corporations. So by now, under the Bourbon reforms, which were almost kind of complete around the 1780s, there was almost nothing left anymore of the feudal society that Spanish colonization began with. And under Carlos de Bourbon, he was later styled as Charles III of Spain. He was king in Italy before he became king of the became the head of the Spanish Empire. What he did to stabilize everything, he suppressed Catalan autonomy. So Catalan language was suppressed. Now you had to communicate in Castilian Spanish. The Catalan was still allowed, but not um, in newspapers and all of that. He built national archives to document the history. Now, the Spanish were obsessed with documenting everything anyway. The Spanish documented everything they were doing. They were making millions of paperwork every year, and they stored them in basements in churches. So what this guy did was he built archives, and he took many of those. He took over many of the archives of the church and built national archives for the Spanish government itself, so that they wouldn't be dependent on the Catholic Church for their historical writings or to write their history. Another thing this guy introduced was that only peninsulares, so Spaniards born in Europe, were allowed to take the top positions of captain general or a viceroy. Because the idea was, if you grew up in Europe, you are familiar with diversity and you're familiar with conflict also. So you're more into keeping the whole empire together. While if you're born in Mexico, you're born in Peru, you're more focused on what's happening over there and not what's happening in the whole empire. That was the philosophy behind it. This angered a lot of folks, but it worked. There was stronger naval control of Spanish America because it was a bigger navy. And Argentina and Venezuela emerged under this guy. Venezuela was literally an area where the king personally invested some of his own finances to establish the kingdom. So Venezuela was a kingdom established by this king. So Venezuela did not come into being by people revolting against Spanish rule. Venezuela was a production of Spanish rule. It was a country established in 1777. I believe on the 1st of September, if I'm correct. But anyway, this guy also came up with a national flag for all the Spanish people. He also came with a national anthem called the Marcha Real, which is still the national anthem of Spain today, till this day. And he also solidified South America's borders because back then there were no clear borders between Portuguese America and Spanish America. especially in the south, near Uruguay, there were conflicts between what belonged to Portugal, what belonged to Spain. He solidified them in several treaties. And he managed to do that without much political conflict. This guy was like a celebrity during his era. Now, I'm going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of reforming this uh, feudalism. So the advantages were there was a better management of Spanish America. Obviously, the commoners felt represented was another advantage. So because that people felt more connected to the empire, as their nation. The local economies were included in the world's economy because Spain had the world's economy back then. So much of the economy, local economies in like say in Panama or in other various parts of South America, even the economy in Alaska, which was also under Spanish rule, were included in the world's economy. So that offered financial options and opportunities for the American Indians also, as well as for the blacks. So the Spanish economy boomed because the export increased a lot. As from South America, from Buenos Aires, was a lot of beef being exported to Europe also, and there was a kind of a middle class that emerged of people that were not noblemen, but they had a lot of economic relevancy, so they mattered in economic economic and political decision making, and there was more autonomy for black folks. There was also another thing. Slavery was not abolished, but blacks, even when they were slaves, had more economic say because of the reforms. But there were also obvious disadvantages to this. Now, let's talk about the disadvantages. There was a growing resentment between wealthy families. Just think about these things. If you are born in Panama and you have another family born in Quito, which that's how they called Ecuador back then. The family in Ecuador, or what back then called Quito, family in Quito, they have their own audiencia to connect with Spain directly. The people in Quito have a strong economy. The people in Panama didn't have a strong economy because it was a cesspool of criminality. So resentment would grow. Even if you would have two families with had money in the same kingdom, there was still a rivalry of who was more relevant than the other. So yes, there was a kind of a middle class that emerged in the Spanish Empire, but with that came problems because before that you had the Catholic Church making most of the decisions, and the Spanish government kind of followed the Catholic Church. Now that the Spanish government took more charge and they boosted the economy and more of the locals became rich, now the locals wanted to use their economic power for themselves and for their own region. They didn't want to use their economic relevancy for other regions. So now the wealthy people, for example, in Buenos Aires, want to keep their wealth in Buenos Aires, and the wealthy people in Chile want to keep their wealth in Chile. The wealthy people in Oregon, which is how they called Alaska all the way to British Columbia back then, wanted to keep their economic relevancy over there because they trade with the Russians often. So you had all those economic interests that developed, and yeah, what do you do with all the cash that increased? And everyone wants to keep the cash to themselves. That was a big problem for them. Now, and the urbanization led to the population of the agricultural sector. Because if most of the people move to cities, then that means most of the farms are abundant. And if the farms are abundant, who is going to do the work on the farms? Without the work on the farms, you have no food, you have no export. So you need to have people on the farms doing the work for there to be an export. But if most people move to cities, then who's doing the work? So the slave labor increased. More slaves from Africa were imported. We had to do the work. But because of that, eventually blacks became more economically powerful in the Spanish Empire because they were the ones doing much of the work. They were the ones that became experienced in the work, not only on the farms, but also in the export, in logistics, in shipping, and all of that. So now, more and more, the Spanish economy became more and more dependent on black labor and black, how to say, black enterprise, because there were also free blacks that also began to invest in the empire. So, because of the growing urbanization and almost the population of the agricultural sector, you had an increase in urban crime, especially in Guatemala. There was a lot of urban crime that increased, like robberies, kidnappings. There were also criminal cartels that emerged. So you had more of the Spanish Navy needed to keep them in check, which they succeeded in doing. So there was a lot of greed that increased in Spanish society in general, and racial tension against black people increased. Because blacks used to be just slaves that do the dirty work or that maintain the roads and all of that. But now, little by little, blacks became regional uh, economic forces that they couldn't ignore. And this angered many of the white Spanish Americans who felt entitled to special treatment because they were white. Now, the Spanish government, nor the Catholic Church, embraced this thinking, but that's the racial attitude they had. So, the increasing economic relevancy of the black slaves, as well as the free blacks or the black folks in general, angered a lot of people. All right. So, let's go to the next slide. So, over time, by the way, this is a British map of the Kingdom of Guatemala and portions of Mexico and the Kingdom of Yucatan. What happened was that over time, around the end of the 18th century, there were a few hotspots of wealth and population throughout the Spanish Empire. In, in the ancient part, Manila, of course, but throughout the rest, including mainland Spain, it were just a few urban hotspots that became the powerful centers. Some of these names you will recognize because the places are still named the same way. For example, Santa Fe de Bogota is called Bogota today. Cartagena de Indias in Colombia is today just called Cartagena. San Francisco de Quito is still called San Francisco de Quito, but they name it Quito shortly. What you see here is that only several cities eventually absorbed much of the riches of the empire and much of the population. That means that the other cities, other towns were deprived. They were left behind. So all this resentment would lead to small riots here and there, but it weren't very big issues. In general, the public still felt proud to be Spanish citizens and to be Spaniards because hey, they had the world's economy. But you should understand that once this is going on, those cities also go into to form their own identities and begin to compete with one another. So I use the Spanish Empire and how it developed to reveal why feudalism eventually does not work in the long run. Now, feudalism is successful in arranging social relationships. Okay, because fallen mankind wants to have external structures to arrange to make things work. They just want to rely on external structures. But here's the thing: before I go to the buts, feudalism also allocates riches to noble estates and the government. Because even though yet commoners also becoming economically relevant, most of the riches went to the government and the noble houses, straight up. So the noble houses, as well as the Catholic Church, managed to maintain their economic relevancy over the public. And because, oh dear, I need to change this over here. There's a small spelling error over here that I didn't notice before, so hold on. Let me go over here and change that. Societal, okay. Good. So in a feudal system, people eventually are in agreement how things should be, so societal conflicts are reduced. but over time, it's difficult to sustain. All right? And as we know, the Spanish Empire eventually collapsed because the white supremacists did not want to embrace all black people as free Spanish citizens. Now, the blacks that were free were Spanish citizens. But if all the blacks would become free, then blacks would be the number one economic power in the whole Spanish world. And that means they would also be the ones taking over the world's economy. And this is something that white supremacists didn't want. And that's why the white supremacists destroyed Spanish America from the inside out just to shut down black folks. And that's how slavery continued for a little while, till Britain forced them to stop it. So now you know why the Spanish Empire collapsed. And now you know why they made up those stories of Simon Bolivar and those liberators just to hide the real reason why Latin America today is as messed up as it is. Now, about feudalism. Did feudalism completely go away? Now, as I mentioned before, feudalism is an ideal, okay? It doesn't mean that it always works out as people imagine it. Now, the question, did feudalism disappear? No, it did not. Now, this is a image you can find on Google, and it compares the feudal system of the Middle Ages and the pre-modern era with the present globalist system we have today. So they equate monarchs and emperors to the central bankers of today. They equate the gentry with the big bankers, the clergy with the corporate elite, the royal ministers with the elected officials, the merchants with the top bureaucrats, the vessels with the top professionals, and everyone else is just the people who have to go to work every day from 9 to 5. Now, whether you agree with this division or not does not matter. Feudalism is a fantasy of fallen mankind. It's a fantasy of having an external structure arranging everything for you without you having to be involved. In practice, it always goes wrong. But feudalism is the stronghold of fallen mankind that always go back towards. And right now, with this whole great reset talk that goes on, the world's elite wants to revive the feudal system, but in a corporate way. That's what they want. And I already explained that before. So, now you know why historians seldom talk about the Spanish Empire, because they don't want to admit why it crashed. Now you know why Latin American historians seldom talk about the past 200 years of their history when they became independent, because then they need to admit that their racism against black folks backfired, and it's because of that that Latin America till this day is haunted by poverty, crime, and stagnation. So that has been a long lecture. It's a lot of information. Um, are there any questions? Let me know in the live chat, please. Mhm. Take your time to ask questions. I'm still here, so I'm able to answer your questions if you have any. Thanks, Justin. I'm glad you learned from it. So the reason I made this live is for you to realize that that the world's history is a cycle. They are going back to feudalism, even though that's been proven over and over again that feudalism eventually will crash. Okay? Someone asked about the casta system. What do you mean with the casta system? Hold on. Oh, yes, I know what you mean now. The caste system, I remember it again. It's how they divided the Spanish society. Now, one thing I need to explain about the casta system to you. The casta system was not a firm thing in the early days of the Spanish Empire. It only became a firm thing later when resentment grew against blacks becoming economically relevant. Now, there were racial tensions, of course, but the whole concept of race wasn't really that much of a thing. It later became when they had to divide the economic power. And blacks didn't have any economic power in the beginning, even though they were the ones that kept the economy going. But once blacks began to gain economic power, resentment grew, and the racial ideas from Europe became more and more popular. Okay, that's a casta system. Um, Marky Mark asks, do you think in today's era getting involved in agriculture would be a good idea? Yeah, absolutely. Being involved in agriculture is always a good idea. Because you become self-sufficient in the sense that you can you can have your own food, you can own your own plot, you can not, or you can possess your own plot of land. God owns the earth. You can possess a plot of land where you don't have to pay rent, where you can build your house. You don't have to pay rent and any of that. If the farm is near a stream, you can even generate your own electricity by using the flow of the stream. So there's a lot of possibilities for us today in agriculture. All right. Danielle said, I would like to see how communities should work and is structured from a Christ centered perspective. Now, from a Christ centered perspective, all communities go their way with Christ. And from every community, you have elders who manage the community and they connect to elders from other communities. And that's how they manage things together. And if there is one believer who is crowned by the Heavenly Father to manage several communities, then he will do that. That is God's design. The world comes with a counterfeit, the world comes with a pyramid scheme called feudalism. That's a counterfeit that the world comes up with. Hmm. Yes, if I miss any other questions here. So yes, getting involved in agriculture is a very good idea because listen, saints, for us to escape the terrors of the Antichrist system, we need to be economically relevant. And I just explained to you how feudalism always fails eventually. So every time the Antichrist system wants to give a boost to feudalism, don't get along with it. Make sure you build your economic relevancy and so that you can say no to the wilds of the world. By the way, Latin America today is still haunted by the independence conflicts that they started just because they want to live together with the black folks. So Latin America is still haunted by a lot of psychic violence, a lot of generational curses. There are agricultural, industrial potential. There's industrial and agricultural potential in Latin America, of course, but beware. What you also learned during this live stream is that the Catholic system managed to remain economically relevant by taking action, by being ahead of stuff. The Spanish government in the beginning was quite slow. It was the Roman Catholic Church that undertook steps in order to map out the area and all of that. And that's why till this day, when you go to Latin America, the Catholic Church is the number one economic power, often at the expense of the public. So we should learn from the diligency of the Roman Catholic Church. We should be active and out there so that we know what goes on and we can take advantage of what's going on. That's why I had to give you the whole history of this, so you can realize that economic relevancy is achieved by remaining alert and by taking chances in life. Not gambling, but by taking practical risks. You should never gamble, but you should take practical risks. So, are there any more questions or remarks? Let me know in the live chat. I'll wait. Danielle, the reason why Hispanics have so much animosity is because their ancestors 200 years ago, I mean, it's a big portion of them, ruined their world dominance just to shut down black folks. And now they are the joke of the world, being exploited by everyone. Now they're the ones, they are the ones, they are the descendants that have to deal with a region plagued with crime, poverty, child trafficking, and all of that. That's a lot for those people to face. So instead of facing that and processing the crimes of their ancestors, they prefer to divert that anxiety towards others. That's why there's so much conflict in Latin America. They don't want to process the history, which is their history. Latin America today should have been a black dominated region that's the richest region on the earth. That's what would have become of Latin America, which back then called Spanish America. But hey, they didn't want to have black folks succeeding, so they declared independence and destroyed everything, and then they begged migrants from Europe to come over while they were genociding the black folks that were there. In Argentina, this is what happened. That's why much of Argentina looks so white today, because they genocided the black folks that were there. Even the dark-skinned natives or brown natives were also genocided after independence. So much of the genocide happened after independence. And this is another crime that Hispanics don't want to face. That's why they remain the way they are. Without black slave labor, there wouldn't have been a Spanish empire. There wouldn't have been a Portuguese empire. Without black slave labor, there wouldn't have been a Latin America today. Blacks would have taken over eventually around the 1830s. So that's why from the 1820s, they began to destroy everything because they want to prevent black emancipation. And later, the Hispanics even wanted to build a super country around the Caribbean to maintain slavery, but it failed. And it's when it failed that we had the Civil War in the United States between the Confederacy and the Union. Hey, but all of it backfired. All of it backfired. So there is potential today to be economically relevant anywhere you are. Just take advantage of it. Again, I'm going to give you 2 more minutes to ask questions. If there are no questions, I will close down the live stream. I don't know why I can't say, Danielle. that a lot of white Cubans hate Castro due to his blackness and because he was surrounded by blacks. That may play a role. Okay? But look at this also. Castro wanted all of Cuba to get along, not just the white ones. That's also something that angers them. Yes, Justin, the black hatred of blacks doesn't make any sense. Indeed, it doesn't. There were look, you had the American Indians had their own their own civilizations over there, like the Incas, the Mayans, all of that. So that's not because of blacks, but the empire, the Spanish and Portuguese empires, and how it affected the world is due to blacks. But they never want to admit that. And yeah, that's why they preferred to destroy the whole region than to get along with blacks. But okay, they got what they deserved, and their descendants just get along with it. So that's why it stays the way it is. Now you can research all of this if you go to archives of universities. Spain has online archives that you can just go online and look into historical documents from the past and all of that. So there are ways you can research all of this. You can also go to a library and go to uh, books or research about the slave trade and the Spanish Empire and independence wars, all of that. So you can do all of that. It's still possible. Just realize that they want to make it difficult for you to find out about this because they don't want you to realize that um, the anti-black racism backfired over and over again in human history. They don't want you to see that. And another thing I'm warning you now. I'm warning you. The blacks back then in the Spanish Empire, they gained economic relevancy. They gained economic leverage. And they built houses, they owned land, they were trading. They even bought many of the fellow blacks out of slavery. So they were a growing power. But they did not pay attention to the growing resentment against them. They did not pay attention to the increasing animosity against them. And that was their big mistake. Because many of the blacks even fought for the Spanish king eventually during the Napoleon occupation and all of that. But the anti-black racism was so deep-rooted that the blacks didn't realize that those people would literally prefer to destroy everything than to have them prosperous. And that's what happens. And there's the thing, though those they couldn't exterminate or get rid of the blacks, but they exterminated their own economic relevancy just to prove a point and to ruin the future of their children and their offspring. That's what they did. And the blacks back then didn't realize that they were capable and willing to do this, but they did. So blacks ended up being trapped within the borders of those republics, Spanish-speaking republics, and that impoverished them also. So learn from this. When your economic relevancy increases, I don't care whether you're black, white, Asian, or whatever, the world will not embrace it. There will be some type of retaliation, and if they can't get rid of you, they will self-destruct just to bring you down with them. They will escalate and self-destruct to draw you in their misery. That's how dangerous they'll become. That's how they will escalate once they can't control your economic power. So, whatever you do in this life, make sure you are alert and aware of your environment, please. All right. That is it for now. Where's my mouse? Oh, there it is. Thank you for being here and listening to this history class. Hold on. Let me go back to. Yes. I hope you all learned from this. I hope you all put it into practice. Keep on agreeing with Christ, and I'll see you next time.